Hello everybody, welcome to today's training session, which is an introduction to teaching BTEC Level 2 Hospitality. My name's Charlotte Routh and I'm going to be delivering all of today's training. In today's training, we are going to be looking at understanding the main features of the International Level 2 qualifications in hospitality, understanding how to plan a successful BTEC program, understanding how to write and deliver engaging assessments, and finally, understanding how to quality assure the qualification. First of all, let's have a look at successful BTEC delivery. It's important to understand the basics of a BTEC qualification and some of the key differences between a BTEC and other academic curriculum. So all of the BTEC qualifications are modular and consist of units. The amount of units that you decide to deliver depend on the size of qualification that you are offering within your centre, whether that be an extended diploma or a certificate, for example. If you go to your specification, there will be a table showing the structure of the qualification, and from there you'll be able to find out how many guided learning hours your qualification should have, and then how many units are expected to be completed within that qualification. All of the BTEC qualifications consist of a number of mandatory units, so these are the units that must be completed, plus a number of optional units. You'll also be able to find the information around this in your specification, and all of the units that are mandatory will have an M next to them. All of the BTEC units are assessed separately, and that can be done over the duration of the time that the learners are on programme with you. Unit grades are then combined to create a qualification grade. As you can see from the slide, here is a quick overview of a BTEC teaching and learning and quality assurance overview. So every BTEC has a specification, and that specification outlines what the learner needs to be able to know and be able to do whilst they're on programme in your centre. The specification should be your go-to document. It should be a document that is used daily, and it will give you information about how to plan your lessons, how to sequence your schemes of learning, but also about the assessments and also internal verification. So that specification is one of the most important documents that you should be using whilst delivering your BTEC Level 2 in hospitality. Learners are assessed in two ways on the international programmes. So they are assessed using either Pearson set assignments or authorised assignment briefs, which can be adapted by you, the centre, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. You can find information on this within your specification in the table we were just referring to, as it will tell you whether the units are assessed using a Pearson set assignment or an internal assessment. Regardless of the type of assessment, the BTEC Level 2 in hospitality is 100% internally assessed, which means that you will be making the grading decisions for each of those units. You'll do that by internally assessing against the learning outcomes and the assessment criteria within the specification for that relevant unit. Once the work has been assessed, a sample is then internally verified by somebody within your centre, and that is to check that the standards are being met. Pearson will then engage with you, the centre, at least once a year to standards verify the work that's been completed by your learners to confirm that the standards are met. Providing that there are no compliance issues at that point, you will then be able to claim certificates for the learners that have successfully completed the BTEC after they have completed all of the units that they need to for your size of qualification. You can see here the progression routes from the Level 2 programs. So the award is the equivalent of one international GCSE at 120 guided learning hours, going up to the diploma, which is 4 international GCSEs at 480 guided learning hours. And then hopefully your learners can progress onto the level 3 programs, which have equivalencies against the international A levels. And you can see again, there are a number of sizes. So regardless of the size of qualification that you are running, they are all at level 2 or level 3. So as I've mentioned, your specification should be the document that you use on a daily basis. And within that document, you will find guidance on how many learning hours you need to assign for the size of the qualification, how many units need to be completed. There's some guidance on the content that needs to be taught or delivered and the assessment methods for each of those units. So once you have worked out which units you have to deliver, the mandatory ones, and how many optional units you are going to deliver, you then start to think about how you are going to sequence those units throughout the lifetime of those learners being on the program. You have quite a lot of freedom in how you deliver your program. You can adjust the sequencing of the units depending on what's going on in your centre and what your learners are like. So some of the units you may decide to deliver in a more compressed way over a short period of time. Some of the units you might decide to deliver over an extended period of time. But again, this depends on your timetabling. But there are also some sequencing questions. So whilst the units are numerical within the specification, you do not need to deliver them in that manner. You can deliver the units in whatever order you want to, as long as you are delivering the correct amount of units needed for your size of qualification. You also need to plan in that internal verification, which is the internal scrutiny and quality assurance of the learner's work. And you also need to plan for the external scrutiny of standards verification. Within that specification, as I've mentioned, you have each of the units are all within that one document. And each of those units are set up in a very similar way. So they will have the learning aims that are attached to that unit and the content that needs to be delivered. So 100% of the content needs to be delivered, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be delivered in a traditional classroom setting. It can be delivered via work experience or visits or homework or self-study. It's entirely up to you how that content is delivered. You also have the assessment criteria, which is attached to each of the learning aims, and the assessment criteria is broken down into pass, merit, and distinction criteria. There'll be some information about the grading, and one of the most important parts of the specification related to grading is the essential information for assessment decisions. Also within the specification, you'll see some information around internal assessments and some administrative arrangements as well. Further information that can be found within the specification is things like resource requirements or links to the other units, or some examples or hints and tips around employer involvement. This might be something that you need to read around before you make your decision on some of the optional units that you want to deliver, particularly if there is some resource requirements that are needed. Also, it might help you with your sequencing once you know that there are some distinct links between other units. As the BTEC is a vocational qualification, there is an emphasis on employer involvement, so please make sure that you are reading all of the sections within the specification. So let's now talk about Units with Pearson set assignments. On the table within the specification, these are clearly highlighted in a bluey-grey colour so that they are easily identified. But each of these units is assessed using a Pearson set assignment, and each of those assessments has been set by Pearson to maintain standardization across the world. So regardless of the country that you are in, if a learner is studying a level 2 BTEC in hospitality, they will all be doing the same Pearson set assessments. There will be 2 available for each 1-year period per unit. And the reason for that is because the BTEC is delivered all across the world, and some of your learners' experiences of hospitality will be slightly different because of where you find yourself in the world. So if you are assigned a unit that is assessed using a Pearson set assessment, please, before you embark on the teaching, have a look at the 2 versions of the Pearson set assessment and decide which one is the most relevant to your learners. That might be based on the case study or the scenario that you think is probably going to be the most engaging or motivating for your learners. Once you've made that decision, your whole class or cohort will sit that same assessment. You have access to the Pearson set assessment through Edexcel online, and therefore you will be able to access that information prior to the teaching, but obviously your learners must not have access until they are ready to embark on the assessment. Each of the Pearson set assessments has guidance around exam conditions and timings and supervision. They are not mandatory, they are there as guidance only, and it will depend on your situation, your centre, but most importantly, your learners. So learners must complete the authorised Pearson set assignments for units 1, 2, 4 and 5. But again, please check the specification for your relevant size of qualification. The good thing is that you do not need to write assignments for these units because you are going to be using the Pearson set assignments that have been written for you, and you make no changes to that. The Pearson set assignments will be subject to mandatory standards verification for at least 1 unit per year, and that's to make sure that you have all of the help and guidance around this method of assessment. You do not need to internally verify the Pearson set assignment briefs because they have been written for you and you are making no changes to them. As I've mentioned, there will be 2 available to you, and a resit is allowed. They can be completed at any time of the year that your learners are on programme, but some of the Pearson set assignments are designed to be taken later on in that learner journey. So please make sure that you are reading around the assessment requirements whilst you are planning where they sit in the learner journey. So I'm going to ask you to do an activity. What I would really like you to do is to think about which units are mandatory for your size of qualification, which order of units should you deliver and when, but more importantly, think about why they work best that way. Think about when you should plan for a Pearson set assessment to be completed, and again, why, and how are you going to prepare your learners for this type of assessment. So please pause the recording whilst you work through this activity and then press play when you are ready to start again. Let's now think about creating engaging sessions. It's important to think about blended learning. So delivery should reflect the learning aims from within the specification and the type of content being delivered. You can use the provided teaching resources that are on the main website for your subject area, So within that website, there will be some delivery plans and some schemes of work which you can use as they are, or you can adapt to make fit for your centre. And there's also a delivery guide to help you structure a unit. So please look for those free resources. It's important that you identify the key mandatory content in the unit. As I mentioned, you will have access to the assessments prior to it taking place. Therefore, that might help you to identify which parts of the content you really need to focus on because you know that it forms part of that assessment. And that might be the method of assessment. So it might be that the assessment is asking your learners to present information, and therefore you might want to practice presentation skills with your learners. You need to structure your delivery to help them develop their skills. So that might be combining initial knowledge, where it's the first time the learners have ever looked at that key theory or that content, and then increase complexity throughout your delivery, where you then get them to apply that newfound knowledge to either case studies or real life scenarios so that they're really getting a good understanding of that content. You need to be aware of the assessment and what the learners need to be able to respond to on the completion of the unit, and build in formative assessments that combine knowledge and skills prior to the real assessment taking place. As I mentioned, the BTEC qualification is a vocational qualification, and we need to reflect that in how we deliver our lessons. We need to ensure that our learners have a good understanding of what's going on in the world of hospitality. In order to do that, it's really important that we try and build some external links with local hospitality suppliers. We might be able to use some live client briefs or case studies to bring the world of hospitality to life. If we can we get our learners out on work experience or visits? Can we invite guest speakers in to our centre? But more importantly, make the qualification as active as possible, because the world of hospitality is just that. We also need to think about holistic assessment, and you'll notice that from our Pearson set assessments particularly, that all of the grading criteria is within a task. And then that means that all of our learners need to understand the command verbs and the requirements. So if they see the word explain or demonstrate or analyze, they know what that means in terms of a response. They need to understand the evidence that they need to provide for a task. So if they need to produce a presentation, do they need to include speaker notes? Does the presentation need to have animations? That kind of thing. But the learners need to have the opportunity to meet all of the grading criteria within a learning game. So our next activity is for you to choose a unit from your specification, preferably one that you are already delivering or plan to deliver in the future. And think about how can you reflect the industry and promote vocational learning in your lessons. What kind of potential external links could you build to bring that unit to life? And what types of evidence would you ask your learners to produce in the lead up to that summative assessment? So please press pause on the recording now, and once you've completed the activity, press play. Let's now move on to the other type of assessment, which is internal assessments, which have authorised assignment briefs attached to them. So for the first year of delivery, all centres must use authorised assignment briefs for internal assessments. After that first year of delivery, you can start to create your own assignment briefs. However, there's more risk involved with doing that, and you may decide to continue using those authorised assignment briefs because lots of the hard work has been done for you. The authorised assignment briefs have been prepared by BTEC subject experts, and they can be used to effectively assess those internally assessed units. They are written in quite a generic manner, as they are going to be used across the whole world. So it may be that you still want to make some small adaptations to the authorised assignment briefs to make them more relevant to your learners. And that might be choosing a business or an area of business as the focus of the assessment task. And that might be because you have visited that business or it's somewhere very local to your centre. Or it might also be a business that your learners aspire to work within. You can also amend the evidence requirements within an authorised assignment brief, and that might be because English is a second language, or you want to create a difference between some of the units that you are completing. But you can amend the evidence requirements to whatever you want it to be, as long as the criteria can be met with that assessment evidence method. You can also adapt the resource recommendations. So if there is something very specific that you think your learners need to use in the completion of their assessments, please add that to the resource part of the assignment brief. This is for all of the internally assessed units that you can make these adaptations, but not for Pearson set assignments. So for 1, 2, 4, and 5, you can't make any changes to them, but for the other units, you can. So please now use the authorised assignment brief for your subject area. So please choose one that either you are already delivering or you plan to deliver. And think about, is the scenario and task appropriate for your centre and your learners? If not, what kind of changes could you make? Also think, will the evidence being asked for get the best from my learners, or are there alternatives that you could use? So please press pause now to complete the activity, and once completed, please press play. Let's now have a look at the internal assessment rules. So the lead internal verifier or program manager will grant the learner an opportunity to resubmit assessment evidence where needed. Within a resubmission, all of the grades are still available, and the learner will have 15 working days of the learner receiving the assessment decisions to make those changes. But resubmissions can only be offered if 3 things have been met. So did the learner submit their assessment evidence by the deadline date? Has the work been authenticated as being original by the learner and by you, the assessor? And do you, the assessor, judge that the learner can independently improve their assessment evidence? That last point is really important because during a resubmission, the learner must not receive any further coaching, training, or teaching in order to make those changes. They must do it independently based on the feedback that you have given them in their first marking of that assessment. But resubmissions are there as a safety net for learners that are likely to fail the unit because they have missed vital pass criteria or have not completed the work to the standard that you would have expected. That's not to say that resubmissions should be offered to every single learner. And if that is the case, your standards verifier will question why that has happened. Using the International Centre Guide, please make sure that you are aware of what happens if a learner still does not meet pass criteria after a resubmission. Please pause the presentation whilst you find that document and the relevant information, and press play when you are ready. Let's now look at the internal verification of the assessment decisions. So internal verification is a quality assurance process that is undertaken by you and your colleagues in your centre. Pearson's role is to check that the learners receive the grades that they have earned. And so in order to do that, we ask you to do some jobs internally to make sure that that is all done correctly. Let's now look at internal verification in a bit more detail. So Pearson's role is to check that learners receive the grades that they have earned so that we have a good understanding of what's happened in your centre and make sure that the learners get the grades that they deserve. And in order to do that, we ask you to do some jobs throughout the academic year. The basics around internal verification is that it's a centre-based quality assurance system, making sure that the assignment briefs, which are the assessment tools, are fit for purpose, and also that the assessment decisions being made are accurate. Internal verification is undertaken by subject specialists in your centre. It needs to be somebody other than the assessor that is completing the role of internal verifier. It involves the assessor and the internal verifier, but not the learners. They have completed the work and therefore you just work with your colleagues internally within your centre to complete the quality assurance process. The whole point of internal verification is to support the assessor in terms of compliance with BTEC standards, but also for their own continuous improvement. But it is not a tick box exercise. It does feed into the standards verification process that happens at least once a year, and so it should be taken seriously. Let's look at some of the roles and responsibilities around internal verification. So if you are the assessor or the teacher or tutor, you're responsible for teaching the content that can be found within the unit specification. And you'll teach that however you seem most appropriate for your learners. You're also responsible for generating the assignment briefs for the units that you have been allocated. That might be making small adaptations to your internal assessments, but also choosing which Pearson set assignment version you are going to work with. You're also responsible for accurately assessing the learner's assessment evidence, and you'll do that by using the learning aims and the associated assessment criteria. And you'll also be responsible for generating and recording accurate learner feedback and achievement. And you'll do that using the assessment record sheets and also, where necessary, annotating the learner's work to identify where criteria has or has not been met. If you have the responsibility of being an internal verifier, you're responsible for checking that the assignment briefs are fit for purpose prior to them being handed out to the learners. You're also responsible for checking that the assessor has accurately assessed learners' assessment evidence, and this is done through sampling. You're also responsible for generating and recording internal verification findings on the relevant paperwork and providing feedback to the assessor and ensuring that any remedial actions are carried out. Any issues with assignment briefs need to be completed and signed off prior to the assignment brief being given the assignment brief, and any issues with assessment decisions need to be actioned before the final grade can be given to the learners. You may also be the lead internal verifier or program manager, so you may have the overarching responsibility in terms of quality for a specific program. And your main responsibility is to make sure that the standardization of your assessors and internal verifiers is completed. And that's to make sure that the whole team knows how to interpret the assessment requirements in a unit specification by using the assessment criteria or the essential information for assessment decisions. Can the team write a fit for purpose assignment brief or at least make amendments to it? Can they accurately assess learner assessment evidence? And can the team complete the necessary auditable forms? And it might be that you set aside some sessions throughout the academic year where you practice some of those skills as a team. Internal verification needs to be rigorous in its approach. It needs to conform to a centre-wide process. So if you are offering other BTECs alongside your level 2 hospitality, you should all be maintaining the same standard regardless of the subject area. Internal verification needs to be planned and managed by you, the centre, and that needs to be done in advance, preferably before you start delivering the programme, so that everybody who has responsibility for internal verification knows when and what they need to be checking. The system needs to be well administered, meaning that all of the paperwork needs to be completed, it all needs to be signed, and it's not holding up that assessment process for your learners. It needs to be carried out in a timely manner. So we can't give out an assignment brief until it's been checked by your internal verifier and signed off. We can't give the learners their final grades until a sample of the assessment decisions has been checked. The whole process needs to be monitored, and that might be by the lead internal verifier or a quality nominee. But it should inform continuous improvement. The whole point of doing this is to make sure that you are delivering the best program that you possibly can to your learners. It needs to be supportive and non-threatening, which is why it works best if colleagues are internally verifying each other's work, and therefore the responsibility doesn't just land on one person's shoulders. It does, however, need to be taken seriously, or it doesn't fulfill its function, and it's not worth the time that you are dedicating to it if you're not doing it seriously and to your full ability. So let's now look at the stage 1 of internal verification, which is the assignment brief stage. You can see the document on the slide that you will be completing if you are internally verifying an assignment brief prior to it being handed out to your learners. And please remember that Pearson set assessments do not need to be internally verified. If you are internally verifying an internal assessment, you need to check that the assignment brief has accurate unit and program details on it. Is it clear when the learners need to hand in their assessments and when it's going to be handed out to them? Does it include a suitable vocational scenario? Does it accurately indicate the criteria that will be targeted by the task? Will it offer a full opportunity for the learners to generate sufficient evidence? Does it clearly state what that evidence is? And is it really clearly laid out and easily understandable by your learners? If you're using an authorized assignment brief, lots of these things will have already been checked for you, but you will still need to check that the dates are appropriate for the task that's being asked of by your learners. Stage 2 of the internal verification process takes place after the learner has completed their work and after the assessor has made their grading decisions using the specification. The internal verifier then verifies a sample of the assessment decisions, and that's to make sure that the assessor's decisions are accurate when judged against the requirements within the specification. Are the assessor's decisions consistent when judged against the specification? Is there summative feedback from the assessor judging and justifying why criteria has or has not been awarded? Have the assessment rules been followed for submissions and resubmissions? And you are a second pair of eyes to make sure that there is no evidence of collusion or plagiarism within the learner's assessment evidence. This process needs to take place for every type of assessment, so both internal assessments and Pearson set assessments. So a sample of every single assessment that takes place needs to be looked at and paperwork completed for each of those assessments. We've mentioned sample sizes multiple times now when it comes to internal verification. And most centres want to know kind of what's the percentage of work we need to look at. Unfortunately, Pearson do not give a specific sample size because what we want you to work on is a risk-based analysis. So when you're choosing a sample size, you need to consider as a minimum whether the programme is new or established. If it's a new program, it poses more risk of getting things wrong, therefore your sample size needs to increase. You need to think whether your assessor is new to BTEC or the unit. If they are, they pose more of a risk and therefore your sample size needs to increase. If you have a particularly large group of learners, then your sample size needs to reflect that, and the more learners you have, the bigger your sample should be. We would like your internal verifier to see across the grades. So within the sample, we want to see some pass, some merit, and some distinction pieces of work so that we get a really good, clear picture of what that assessment looked like. It might be that you have multiple forms of evidence that have been generated by your learners, or it's a new form of evidence that you've asked your learners to produce, and therefore again the risk goes up, and so your sample size also needs to go up. You may have some known issues over time. For example, a staff member may have left midway through the teaching of a unit, or you may have had learner complaints, or you may have had some standards verification feedback based on grading. And if that's the case, it may be that your sample size needs to be adjusted. Other factors could include if you have multiple assessors on one unit, or that the students are completing their assessments in different locations. Therefore, your internal verifier needs to see across the assessors and across the locations within their sample. So the sample size should react to what's going on in your centre. And it may be that those fluctuations are based on findings of previous assessments or previous feedback that you have received. Lots of further support and resources are available to you. So you have a subject advisor, and your contact information can be found via the Pearson website. We also have the customer service portal. So if you are unsure of how to get in contact with a subject advisor or someone from Pearson, please use that customer service portal and Pearson will get back to you as soon as possible. We also have some blended learning digital ebooks available for some of our courses, and information around those can be found on the Pearson website. There's also some textbooks that are available for some of our subject areas. So again, please make sure that you are reading the relevant information found within the guidance for your subject area. And we also have the Learning Hub, which is a repository for training information and other resources that you might find applicable and needed for your current circumstances. So please check out all of those other further support and resources. There's also future training events taking place, so please make sure that you are looking at the diary and sign yourself up to any of the future training that you think is appropriate for you or your centre. Just a little bit of an insight around the ebooks. The ebooks are a paid for resource and they are not mandatory, but they do give you some great resources around preparing your learners for assessment, and also some of those blended learning options where you can set learning to take place outside of your classroom. So you as a teacher will have a dashboard to show whether learners have accessed the material, and the learners can access that on a mobile or desktop app. So thank you for your time today. I hope you are really successful in your Level 2 International Qualification in Business, and I hope to see you at a live event sometime soon. Thank you very much.